My lawyer called me at 6:15 in the morning. Not his paralegal. Not an email from the firm's automated calendar system. Robert Hale himself, on a Saturday, calling from a number I didn't even know he used outside the office. I'd been his client for 19 years, ever since Margaret and I bought the hardware store on Del Mar Boulevard, and in all that time Robert Hale had never once called me before 9 a.m. on a weekday, let alone before sunrise on a weekend. I was standing in my garage in St. Louis, Missouri, running a rag over the chrome on my father's old drill press, the way I did most Saturday mornings when I couldn't sleep past 5 anyway. I picked up on the first ring. He said, "Walt, it's Robert. I need you to come down to the office this morning. Are you free?" I said, "What's this about, Robert?" "It's Saturday," he said. "I'd rather show you than tell you over the phone. Can you be here by 9? There was something underneath his voice. Something I recognized the way you recognize weather changing before the sky actually does anything about it. Robert Hale was not a man who overreacted. He'd built his practice on being the calmest person in any room, the kind of lawyer who read a contract twice before he'd even raise an eyebrow. What I heard in his voice that morning was not panic. It was the specific, careful tone of a man who has found something he doesn't yet know how to say out loud. I said, "I'll be there at 9. I finished wiping down the drill press. I let the dog out, an old beagle named Scout that my grandson had named after a book he was reading in 6th grade, and that still barked at the mail truck every single morning like it was the first time. I put on my jacket. I drove to Robert's office on Manchester Road. He met me in the lobby instead of having me wait by the reception desk, which struck me as strange, and he walked me straight back to his private office instead of the conference room where we usually met. He closed the door. He sat down across from me. He slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. He said, "Walt, 3 days ago my office received a certified filing from the probate division of St. Louis County. It's a petition to establish a limited guardianship and conservatorship over you. The petition includes 2 notarized medical evaluations and a psychiatric assessment. All 3 documents are signed by Dr. Louis Everhart." I looked at the envelope. He said, "Walt, I called Louis Everhart's office yesterday afternoon to confirm the filing, as a courtesy, before we even had this conversation. Louis told me he has never evaluated you for cognitive competency in his life. He's never signed a psychiatric assessment for anyone, because he's not a psychiatrist. He's your internist. Every signature on those documents is forged." I opened the envelope. I looked at the first page. It was formatted like a legitimate clinical evaluation, complete with a letterhead that looked close enough to Dr. Everhart's actual practice, an address on South Kings Highway that was 1 digit off from his real office. The patient name was mine, Walter Eugene Bricker. The evaluation described early-stage vascular dementia, impaired judgment regarding financial matters, and disorientation regarding time and place on 2 separate occasions. I turned the page. A second evaluation, dated 6 weeks after the first, claimed the condition had progressed. A psychiatric addendum, 2 pages, recommended the court appoint a conservator to manage my financial affairs in light of the documented and worsening cognitive decline of the respondent. At the bottom, a signature that had clearly been traced or copied, close enough to pass a glance but wrong in the pressure and the slant if you'd seen the real one as many times as I had, on 18 years of prescription refills and insurance forms. I looked up. Robert was watching me with the patience of a man who has delivered hard news before and knows the correct thing to do afterward is wait. I said, "Robert, I have never had a cognitive evaluation." "Not once," he said. "I know, Walt," I said. "These dates, March 3rd and April 14th. On March 3rd, I was in Nashville for my granddaughter's college graduation. I have the hotel folio and 400 photographs to prove it. On April 14th, I was at the VA hospital getting my knee looked at, a scheduled appointment I've had on the books since January." He said, "I believe you." I said, "Who filed this petition?" Robert picked up a cover sheet from the corner of his desk. He said the petition was filed by a Dennis R. Kowalski, who identifies himself in the filing as the son-in-law of the respondent. I set the envelope down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself not to crush. Outside Robert's window, Manchester Road moved through an ordinary Saturday morning, delivery trucks and joggers, and a day that had no idea what it was carrying inside this office. Robert said, "Walt, I've already called the Missouri State Board of Registration for the Healing Arts on Lewis's behalf, since it's his license being used fraudulently. I also called the probate clerk's office before I called you. The hearing on the conservatorship petition is scheduled for 3 weeks from this coming Thursday. 3 weeks. He said, I wanted you to hear this from me before anyone else could get to you first, and because whoever did this used a real physician's name and license to do it, and that is not something I am going to let stand quietly. He reached for his phone. He dialed. He said into the receiver, Carla, pull the complete Bricker file, everything since 2007, and I need a certified copy by end of day Monday. He hung up and looked back at me. He said, what do you need from me right now? I said, everything you've already started. And one more thing. He said, name it. I said, don't soften this for me. He said, Walt, I have never softened anything for a client in 31 years. I'm not starting today. I picked up the envelope. I stood. I thanked him. I walked out through the lobby into the Manchester Road morning and stood on the sidewalk in the cool April air, holding the envelope in both hands like it might come apart. Dennis had filed a petition to have me declared incompetent. He had forged a physician's signature to support it. He had scheduled a hearing 3 weeks out, and he had done all of this while calling me every Sunday afternoon to ask how my knee was healing and whether I needed help with the yard. I did not feel rage standing there, and I want to be honest about that because it matters to how the rest of this went. What I felt was something more organized than rage. I spent 34 years as a claims underwriter for a mid-sized insurance carrier out of downtown St. Louis, and what I felt on that sidewalk was the specific, cold clarity of a man whose entire career had trained him to see exactly this kind of exposure the moment it revealed itself. I knew precisely what I was looking at. The only open question left was what I was going to build to stop it. My name is Walter Bricker. I'm 68 years old. I live in South Street. Louis in the same house I've lived in since 1979. And the man who filed that petition against me had made one catastrophic error in judgment. He had spent almost 2 years positioning himself around a man he assumed was aging quietly into confusion. What he had actually positioned himself around was 34 years of underwriting discipline and a filing cabinet that would make an IRS auditor weep with gratitude. He had no idea, and he had 3 weeks before he found out. I built my career the slow way, starting as a claims adjuster in 1981 and working my way up until I was underwriting commercial policies for the last 20 years before I retired. An underwriter's whole job is risk. You look at a situation and you ask, what is the actual probability this goes wrong, and what does it cost the company if it does? After 34 years of that, you stop being able to turn it off. You keep records. You verify things twice. You do it not because you expect trouble, but because you know from decades of experience that trouble arrives exactly when you've stopped expecting it. Margaret and I bought the house on Loughborough Avenue in 1979, a 2-story brick place in a neighborhood where the sidewalks buckle from tree roots that are older than most of the people walking on them. Margaret Ellen Bricker, born Margaret Ellen Souza in Belleville, Illinois, taught 4th grade for 29 years and had the kind of quiet intelligence that noticed everything and announced almost none of it. She kept a small spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer where she wrote things down, grocery lists next to lines from books she was reading, next to little observations about our grandchildren, next to things I'd said that she wanted to remember. I found that notebook after she passed. I've read it more times than I'd ever admit to anyone but you. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2020 and died that November. At home, in the bedroom we'd shared for 38 years, with our daughter and our son, both there. I won't dwell on that. What I'll tell you is that the house was a different place after she left it, and I learned to manage that difference the way you manage anything structural, by understanding it, accounting for it, and reinforcing wherever reinforcement was needed. We had 2 children. Our son Michael was 46, an electrical contractor living outside of Nashville, the kind of son who called every Sunday without being reminded, and drove up twice that first winter after Margaret died without being asked. He had his mother's quiet and his mother's attention to detail in exactly the right proportion. Our daughter Renee was 43, living out in St. Charles County with her husband, Dennis Kowalski, and their son, Tyler. Renee had her mother's mind, and had spent the last decade or so applying it in the service of a marriage that had slowly recalibrated her in ways I noticed and didn't move fast enough to address. Dennis was 45. He worked as a financial planner at a firm out in Chesterfield. The kind of office with a lot of glass and a parking lot full of luxury sedans that were all financed. He had an easy handshake and a haircut that cost more than mine ever had, and the specific social fluency of a man who had practiced charm as a professional skill for so long it no longer took effort. He remembered birthdays. He asked good follow-up questions. He said the right thing at the right time with the consistency of someone who understood that trust gets built in small, careful increments. I knew within the first year of meeting Dennis that he was a man who calculated relationships the way other men calculate football odds, maybe not even consciously, but structurally, the way it's just built into how he moves through a room. Margaret knew within 20 minutes of meeting him. She didn't say it outright. What she said, driving home from that first Thanksgiving dinner in 2012, was, "Walt, that man is always running numbers in his head." I told her. I knew what she meant. She said she knew I did. The early years were unremarkable on the surface. Dennis and Renee bought a house in St. Charles in 2015. Tyler was born in 2017. They came to Loughborough Avenue for every holiday, and Dennis was always precisely calibrated, warm without being overbearing, attentive in the way that made him seem like exactly the son-in-law a man should feel lucky to have. What I noticed and logged without acting on started around 2021. Comments about whether I'd updated the deed on the house. Questions about whether Margaret's life insurance had cleared yet. Gentle suggestions that he could take a look at my retirement accounts, just as a professional courtesy, no charge. The pattern of a man who had decided that proximity to something valuable is a form of pre-ownership. Margaret had noticed too, before she got sick, and she said something to me one night in the fall of 2019, sitting up in bed with her notebook. She said, "Walt, make sure everything is written down somewhere, and make sure somebody besides you knows where it is." I didn't fully understand the specific urgency of that at the time. I understood it later. After Margaret died, Dennis's approach shifted the way a strategy shifts when one of its obstacles gets removed. The suggestions about estate planning became more frequent, more specific. In the spring of 2022, he asked whether I'd considered a durable power of attorney, given my age and the fact that I was now living alone in a big house. I told him I was walking 2 miles every morning around Carondelet Park and my doctor had called my last physical excellent for a man my age. I understood in that moment that his question had nothing to do with concern for me. What I hadn't understood yet was how far he'd already decided to take it. I found out exactly how far when my lawyer called me on a Saturday morning at 6:15. I drove straight from Robert's office on Manchester Road to the office of an attorney named Patricia Voss, who specialized in elder law and guardianship litigation, whose office sat above a dry cleaner on South Grand that had been there since before I was born. Robert had referred me to her 3 years earlier when I'd asked him, almost as a hypothetical, whether he knew anyone who handled that kind of case. He'd said, "I know exactly one person in this city who wins these consistently, and her name is Patricia Voss, and she doesn't take appointments, you just show up." I had filed that piece of information away, the same way I filed most things, somewhere I could retrieve it precisely when I needed it. Patricia Voss was 53, compact, and economical with her words in the way that people who don't waste anything tend to be. Her office had a whiteboard with case timelines scrawled across it in 3 different colors of marker. She was on a call when her assistant walked me in. She held up one finger, wrapped the call in under a minute, and said, "Sit. What happened?" I sat down. I put the envelope on her desk. I said, "My son-in-law filed a conservatorship petition against me claiming I have dementia, and he supported it with medical documents that appear to have my doctor's forged signature on them. My doctor confirmed this morning he never signed anything. The hearing is in 3 weeks." She looked at the envelope without touching it yet. She said, "How do you know they're forged?" I said, "Because I've never had a cognitive evaluation in my life, and because my own attorney called my physician's office yesterday and confirmed it directly." She said, "Hi St. Cat and getting, and you can account for where you actually were on those evaluation dates?" I said, "March 3rd, Nashville, my granddaughter's college graduation, hotel folio, photographs, my son's testimony. April 14th, the VA hospital for a scheduled knee appointment, on the books since January, with a check-in timestamp." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "What did you do for a living?" I said, "Insurance underwriter, 34 years. She said, "That explains the receipts." She pulled the envelope toward her and read through it in total silence for close to 2 minutes, turning pages with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who reads clinical and legal documents for a living. She closed the folder and looked at the wall for a second. Then she said, "Mr. Bricker, if these documents are fabricated, which I believe they are, your son-in-law has committed fraud on the court, fraud against you personally, and unauthorized use of a licensed physician's credentials. In Missouri, those are 3 separate felony exposures." I said, "I understand that." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, "I want the petition dismissed with prejudice. I want the forged documents on a permanent record that follows Dennis Kowalski wherever he goes professionally. And I want to be standing in that courtroom when he finds out exactly what he walked into." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Those are 3 realistic outcomes." She picked up her pen. She said, "Tell me everything, from the start. Don't skip anything you think doesn't matter. I'll be the judge of that." I told her everything, start to finish, for almost an hour. She wrote the entire time in handwriting. I couldn't read, and never once interrupted. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Did Dennis have legitimate access to any of my accounts? No. Everything had been redesignated to Michael as successor after Margaret died. Did my daughter know what Dennis had done? I said I honestly didn't know, and I wanted to find out before I assumed anything either way. Did I have documentation of the conversations where Dennis had raised power of attorney and estate matters? I said, "I keep contemporaneous notes on every conversation that matters. I have entries going back to 2021. She set her pen down. She said, "Mr. Bricker, I've handled 26 guardianship cases in this county. Maybe 3 clients have ever walked in here with what you just handed me." I said, 34 years underwriting risk. Documentation isn't a habit for me. It's a reflex." She almost smiled. She said, "Let me tell you what happens next." The first call Patricia made in front of me was to the probate clerk's office to formally enter her appearance on my behalf. That single call changed the entire posture of the case, because it signaled I wasn't going to be quietly processed. The second call was to a private investigator named Roy Denby, who worked out of a small office near the river in Soulard, wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every meeting I ever had with him, and cared about what was true rather than what anybody wanted to be true. He called Patricia back 4 days later with what he'd found. What Roy found was not a spur-of-the-moment scheme. What Roy found was an architecture. Dennis had spent nearly 2 years researching Missouri guardianship statutes, found a document preparation service out of Fenton that produced convincing template medical forms, and constructed a paper trail describing 4 office visits to Dr. Everhart's practice that had never happened. The forged letterhead was close enough to the real one to pass a casual glance. He had lifted Dr. Everhart's actual signature from a letter the doctor had written to Margaret during her cancer treatment in 2020, a letter that had passed through our house during the estate paperwork after she died. He had used my late wife's own medical records to steal her doctor's signature. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it myself when I first heard it. Roy also found that Dennis had opened a business banking account at a bank out in Chesterfield under an entity called Kowalski Family Asset Management LLC, registered in October of the previous year. Stated purpose: financial management services for family members. No clients, no revenue, no deposits. A clean, empty shell built and waiting to receive something that hadn't arrived yet. Patricia stared at that account information for a long time. She said he built the receiving structure before he built the fraud. He was that confident you'd be processed through without a fight. I said, "He's known me for 11 years. She said, "He saw what he expected to see. A 68-year-old widower, alone in a big house, easy to manage. He saw the outside and drew the wrong conclusion entirely." I said, "My wife used to say he was always running numbers." Patricia said, "She was right. He just wasn't running the numbers that actually mattered." Then there was the matter of Renee. I have to talk about that conversation separately, because it's the part of this whole thing that cost me the most, and the part I've turned over in my head the most since. I called her on a Tuesday evening, 10 days before the hearing. Patricia had told me the conversation needed to happen before we walked into that courtroom, so I'd know exactly where my daughter stood. Renee answered on the second ring, her regular voice, easy, unsuspecting. I told her to listen all the way through before saying anything. Then I told her everything: the envelope, the forged signatures, the timeline Roy had put together, the LLC sitting empty in Chesterfield, waiting for something. All of it, without stopping once. Goo. Goozy. When I finished, the line went quiet for long enough that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. She said, "Dad, I didn't know about any documents. I swear I didn't know he'd done that." I said, "What did you know?" She said, "He told me he'd filed something to protect you, because you were alone in that big house and getting older, and that you'd probably fight him on it at first because you're stubborn." He showed me a summary, not the whole filing. He said the legal parts were too technical to bother me with. I sat with that for a second. The legal parts were too technical. That's the exact kind of language a man uses when he needs his wife cooperative without actually being informed. I said, "Are you going to stand behind what Dennis did, or are you going to tell the truth?" A long silence. The particular sound of somebody finally looking directly at something about her own life she'd been avoiding for a while. She said, "I'll tell the truth, whatever it costs." I said, "Meet with Patricia tomorrow morning. Bring everything in writing, texts, emails, all of it." She said, "I have texts, Dad. A lot of them." I said, "I know. And Renee, I love you. That doesn't change no matter how this goes. But what Dennis did is a crime, and how you handle the next 10 days matters a great deal for what happens after." She said quietly, "I know, Dad." Right before we hung up, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions." I said, "Ask them from now on." I sat at my kitchen table after that call and thought about something Margaret had said about Renee once, years before any of this. She said Renee had my stubbornness and Dennis's blind spots in equal measure, and that she'd find her own way out eventually, if I gave her the room to do it. I'd given her the room. She found it. Patricia met with Renee that Wednesday and called me that afternoon. 51 text messages spanning almost a year. Renee had understood there was a legal filing happening. She had not known the medical documentation was forged. She had been deceived by her own husband, and that was both the accurate read and the legally meaningful one. Patricia also told me she'd filed a formal complaint with the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. In addition to the medical board referral, Robert had already triggered on Dr. Everhart's behalf. She said, "Are you ready for Thursday?" I said, "I've been ready since I was standing on the sidewalk outside Robert's office with that envelope in my hands." Michael drove up from outside Nashville on Wednesday evening without asking if he should. He called at 3 and said he was already on the road. He got in around 9, and we sat at the kitchen table and I told him everything, start to finish. He listened the way his mother used to listen, all the way through, no interruptions. When I finished, he looked at the table for a second. He said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I'm functioning." He said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Okay, comes after Thursday." Then he said, "Mom used to say you were good at taking care of everything except yourself." I said, "She was right about most things." We talked until almost midnight. I lay awake that night, not out of fear, just full awareness, the way you lie there the night before something that matters. I thought about Margaret's notebook in the kitchen drawer. I thought about 34 years of building habits that outlast whatever created them in the first place. Then I fell asleep. The St. Louis County Probate Court on Thursday morning was unremarkable in the way courthouses always are. Beige hallways and fluorescent light, and decades of procedure worked into the floor tile. Patricia met me in the hallway at 8:40. Michael stood beside me. Dr. Everhart showed up at 8:45 because Patricia had asked him to appear in person, and he'd agreed without hesitation. At 9:02, Dennis and his attorney walked in. His attorney, a man named Gary Stallman, had the look of someone expecting a routine morning. Dennis was in a dark suit, composed, the full professional presentation of a man who expected to leave that courtroom with something he'd been building toward for 2 years. He saw me in the hallway, and his expression recalibrated fast, then recovered. He said, "Walt, I didn't expect you'd show up in person." I said, "It's a hearing about whether I've lost my mind, Dennis. Where else would I be?" He said, "I hope you understand this comes from a place of real concern." I said, "I know exactly where it comes from." His attorney touched his arm, and they moved into the courtroom. The judge was the Honorable Diane Castellano, 16 years on that bench, known for having very little patience for hearings that wasted the court's time. She looked at the file. She looked up. She said, "This is a petition for limited guardianship and conservatorship in the matter of Walter Eugene Bricker. Counsel, please identify yourselves for the record." Gary Stallman identified himself as counsel for Dennis Kowalski, the petitioner. Patricia identified herself as counsel for Walter Bricker, the respondent. Judge Castellano looked at Patricia for a moment. She said, Miss Voss, I've reviewed your filing from Monday. I want to confirm on the record that the respondent is present and consents to appearing today. I said, I'm present, Your Honor, and I more than consent. I asked that this date be kept as scheduled. The judge looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral, though I thought underneath it there might have been something close to interest. She said, Very well. Mr. Stallman, you may present the basis for the petition. Gary Stallman stood and walked through the petition in the practiced language of a man who'd made this kind of argument plenty of times before. He referenced the medical evaluations. He referenced the psychiatric addendum. He placed the documents on the evidence table. He said the medical record showed a clear pattern of progressive cognitive decline, and that the petitioner, as son-in-law and concerned family member, had sought a legal mechanism to protect my care and financial well-being. He said the physician of record was Dr. Louis Everhart of the South Kings Highway Internal Medicine Practice. Judge Castellano looked over at Dr. Everhart, seated in the gallery. She said, Is Dr. Everhart present? He stood. He said, Yes, Your Honor. She said, Doctor, are these your documents? He said, They are not, Your Honor. I have never conducted a cognitive evaluation on Mr. Bricker in 18 years of treating him. I have never written a psychiatric assessment for any patient, because I am not a psychiatrist. I did not sign these documents. I reported the fraudulent use of my license and credentials to the Missouri State Board of Registration for the Healing Arts 3 days ago. I've brought that report, along with Mr. Bricker's complete medical file, which contains no cognitive or psychiatric evaluations of any kind. The courtroom did the thing courtrooms do when something enormous just landed in them, which is that every single person in the room went a little more still than they'd been a second earlier. Not theatrical stillness. The stillness of people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the next hour. Gary Stallman stood frozen at the petitioner's table. Dennis sat beside him, and I watched his face in the exact moment Dr. Everhart finished talking. 34 years of underwriting risk teaches you to recognize that precise instant when a model collides with reality and the two refuse to match. I'd watched that moment happen across a desk more times than I could count. What I saw on Dennis's face was a man realizing, in real time, that the entire structure he'd built over 2 years had just failed, not partially, but completely, all the way down. Judge Castellano said, Mr. Stallman, I want to be very clear with you. The medical documentation underlying this petition has just been disavowed, under oath, by the physician whose name and license appear on it. That physician has already reported this to the State Medical Board. Do you have any response? Gary Stallman's voice had lost the confident register it carried 30 seconds earlier. He said, Your Honor, I had no knowledge of any issue with this documentation prior to this morning. The judge looked at him, then at Dennis. She said, Mr. Kowalski, are you the petitioner in this matter? Dennis stood. He said, Yes, Your Honor. She said, Are you aware that filing fraudulent medical documentation with this court is a criminal offense under Missouri law? A silence. Then Dennis said, Your Honor, I can explain. She said, I don't doubt that you can. She looked back at Gary Stallman. She said, Counsel, I am suspending this proceeding. I am not dismissing it outright. I am referring the fraudulent documentation to the St. Tane matter, Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office for review, and I am entering a formal notation in this record stating that the medical basis for this petition has been challenged by the physician of record and that no independent clinical basis for it currently exists. Then she looked at me directly. She said, Mr. Bricker, I want the record to reflect there is no finding of any kind against you in this proceeding and that this court takes seriously what has been done to you here. She looked back once more at Dennis. She said, Mr. Kowalski, I strongly suggest you speak with your attorney about what comes next. This court is adjourned. She stood and left, and the room reorganized itself in the wake of what had just happened. Patricia touched my arm. She said quietly, That went exactly the way it needed to. Michael stood beside me and put his hand on my shoulder without saying a word, which was exactly right. I looked across the room at the petitioner's table. Gary Stallman was leaning toward Dennis, talking fast and low. Dennis sat perfectly still, the suit and the haircut and the composure all still technically in place, all of it meaning nothing now. He wasn't the same man who'd walked into that courtroom an hour earlier. That man had a plan and a position and 2 years of careful architecture behind him. This man had none of it left. He glanced up once, not deliberately at me, Just the involuntary way people look around when they're trying to reassemble a world that just came apart. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't look away. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him steadily, the way a man looks at a forecast he calculated accurately 2 weeks in advance, and watched land exactly where he expected it to. Then I picked up my jacket and walked out of that courthouse into the April morning, my son beside me, my attorney behind me, and the envelope that started all of it now sitting in Patricia's briefcase as evidence in a case that was just getting started. The prosecuting attorney's office opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks of the hearing. Dennis was charged that summer, 2 counts of fraud upon the court, 1 count of unauthorized use of a physician's professional credentials, and 1 count of financial exploitation of an elderly person, which is the exact language Missouri statute uses for what he'd built toward doing with the rest of my life. He no longer works in financial planning anywhere in the state. The Chesterfield firm let him go the same week the charges were filed. I didn't follow every detail after that, because I didn't need to. Renee filed for divorce that July. She brought all 51 texts to Patricia's office and told the truth on every question anyone asked her. She's my daughter. The difference between being deceived and choosing not to look too hard at something is a distinction I chose to make in her favor. She and Tyler live about 15 minutes from me now, over near Carondelet Park. She comes by for dinner on Sunday evenings. She asks a lot more questions than she used to. Michael drove up from Nashville for the first one of those dinners. The 3 of us sat around my kitchen table, the first time in almost 2 years without that old undertone hanging over everything. Renee said, "Dad, Mom knew about him, didn't she?" I said, "Your mother knew things before most people finished thinking them." She said, "What did she know?" I said, "She knew he was always running numbers. She just knew exactly which numbers." Renee looked down at her plate for a second. Then she said, "I should have asked her more when I still had the chance." I said, "Ask them now. She left plenty of answers behind if you know where to look. Margaret's notebook is still in the kitchen drawer. I haven't moved it. Scout still barks at the mail truck every morning like it's brand new information. The house on Loughborough Avenue is held in the Margaret and Walter Bricker family trust now. Michael is the designated beneficiary. Patricia Voss is the successor trustee. Everything that matters is exactly where I put it, and documented the way it needs to be. I'm 68 years old. I walk 2 miles around Carondelet Park most mornings. I keep contemporaneous notes on every conversation that matters, and I maintain a filing system that any auditor could get through in under 20 minutes. I'm a fully functional adult in every practical and clinical sense there is. The documents that claimed otherwise now sit in a court record as evidence of a crime, and that's the only record that actually matters. My own father used to say a man is the sum of what he builds and what he protects. He drove a delivery truck for a bakery in South City for 39 years, and he built stability and guarded it every single day until the day he passed. I picked that up the same way I picked up most of what mattered, just from being around it long enough. I built something. Somebody tried to take it from me. I protected it with 34 years of documentation, 1 very good attorney, and a doctor who picked up his own phone and made the call himself before anybody had to ask him twice. That's the inheritance that actually matters. More than the house, more than any account balance ever could be.